You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the 1-year anniversary of the death of Osama bin Laden. Ask the residents of one block of flats in East London whether the so-called war on terror is over, and the answer will be an emphatic no. That's because security chiefs are considering mounting surface-to-air missiles on the Bow Quarter estate to stop a 9/11-style air attack on the Olympic Games this summer. Yes, 1 year since the death of Al-Qaeda kingpin Osama bin Laden, and the threat from his organization still looms large. But how realistic is that threat? Do underpant bombers and smoking SUVs in Times Square really warrant their multi-million-dollar security price tag? Has bin Laden's death and countless drone strikes on the Afpak border stripped the terror group of its capacity to attack? Or are members still hatching plans for an Islamist world order from the boondocks of Yemen, Somalia and other chaotic states? To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studios. I'm joined by Christina Hellmich, author of Al-Qaeda, From Global Network to Local Franchise, Tina Soria from the Royal United Services Institute, Peter Eyre, a commentator on the Middle East, Lorenzo Vidino, author of Al-Qaeda in Europe, the new Battleground of International Jihad, and Robert Crowley from the security assessment firm, the Risk Advisory Group. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single sentence answer from each of you to the following question. First of all, to you, Christina, is the heyday of Al-Qaeda over?
Depends on what you consider Al-Qaeda to be. If you think of Al-Qaeda as a strict organization, hierarchical, then yes. If you think of Al-Qaeda as ideology with multiple individualist attacks, then no.
Okay, Tina.
Al-Qaeda as a group, as we know it, AQ core, is actually on the brink of being wiped out. Al-Qaeda as a movement, on the other hand, unfortunately not. The ideology is still alive, and the so-called Al-Qaedaism is still rooted in extremist circles.
Okay, maybe I'll turn to Lorenzo there.
Parts of Al-Qaeda, the people that crafted the ideology of Al-Qaeda 15, 20 years ago, kind of wanted this outcome to some degree. Abu Musab al-Suri used to say that Al-Qaeda is not an organization, nor does he want it to be. So in a way, yes, Al-Qaeda as an organization, as we knew it 12 years ago, is indeed on the ropes, but the message is still out, and there are plenty of organizations and individuals, for example, here in the West, who are willing to carry out the message, who still embrace the message and are willing to carry out the text. Their capabilities are mixed. Some of them are quite amateurish, some of them are quite professional, so the message and to some degree the capabilities are still out there.
Okay, and Robert?
As an organization, the Al-Qaeda Central is obviously losing its capability to mount external attacks, but the movement and the idea is very much alive.
Okay, and last one, Peter.
Categorically, Al-Qaeda doesn't even exist. It's a pseudonym that was given and invented in the States. There is no Al-Qaeda. There are fragmented groups, which I call them freedom fighters, which are, as I said, totally fragmented. And Osama bin Laden didn't die a year ago. He died in December 2001 at the military hospital in Rawalpindi.
Well, I think we'll definitely be coming back to a few of those points, but maybe first of all, I'd like to look at this apartment block in East London, in Bow in East London. It's obviously causing something of a controversy at the moment because of the residents who live there, the possible fixing of surface-to-air missiles to take out a jet that could be launching a 9/11-style attack on the Olympic Games. Tina, this, you think, is a credible threat and a realistic use of resources?
No, the issue is that it's not really down to how much the threat is credible or not, whether the threat is credible or not. It is a matter of planning and getting the resources available for every contingencies. And this is what the security services, the police and the government here in the UK have been doing for the Olympic Games. So ensuring that security for the Games is at the highest level implies that they need to plan and get the resources available for every contingencies. And this is why they are considering possibility of having these missiles deployed over East London.
Robert, do you think it's a viable use of money?
I mean, I'm not sure that it is. At present, neither the UK nor any other country has announced that there's a specific or credible intelligence to suggest that terrorists are planning an attack against or to coincide with the Games. I think everyone knows that major sporting events are attractive targets, but in reality, in my mind, I don't think any established jihadi group at the moment has the capability to be mounting, or probably even the intent to be mounting attacks outside of their operating regions.
Christina, if there's no specific threat, we don't need to take those kind of precautions?
I think the threat that we do face comes from individuals who might be up to no good. And that's maybe oversimplifying it a bit. But the bigger point here is that what I would be afraid of is not some organization or some group in Somalia, Yemen, or elsewhere planning something over here, but it's somebody local, somebody who's enraged and comes up with a very creative kind of attack. And these are difficult to preempt, difficult to predict. So I don't think it's overstating a threat. It's taking it seriously, but at the same time not making too much out of it.
Lorenzo, did you hear about this news story from the UK, and do you think it's a viable use of resources?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to look at it also from a political point of view. What if something were to happen and then authorities did not have anything in place? So the political backlash would be enormous. I think there's also the deterrence factor there that is always there in counterterrorism, showing that there is a high level of security might deter certain individuals from carrying out attacks. Terrorists we've seen these last few years have tended to go for softer targets, and the Olympics are hardly becoming a soft target, or at least part of it. I think it's fair to say that there are some individuals that are in the UK that are up to no good, have the intentions, and we've seen that quite a few of them have the operational connections with groups in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia, or other places, so they might have acquired some capabilities, some skills carry out slightly more sophisticated attacks. So it's difficult to say. We don't know if there is a specific threat. Authorities would not necessarily tell us if there is. So I don't think it's illogic for authorities to put something like that in place.
And Peter, what do you say to the residents of this block in East London about the way that their government is spending money and converting their building?
I think it's a bit of an overkill when you consider there's also going to be a carrier. They're even talking about bringing the latest guided missile up the Thames as well. Let's put things into perspective here. I put this under the big name of Islamophobia. It's an overreaction. I would challenge anyone, my panel here, and people outside listening, that if they would like to point out to me any Islamic attack in the West over a couple of decades, if you want to go back, we could go back to the Madrid bombing that was initially blamed on them and dispelled. The 9/11, as we know, was an inside job, Mossad-orientated. And the guests are smiling now, that's fine. I am an aviation expert by trade, and I can assure you the aircraft couldn't carry out the feats that were described on that day. So we'll put that to one side. And with regards to the missiles, the logic in having a missile on top of a block of flats, as I understand from the guests, is to protect against aircraft that may be doing, quote, a 9/11 type scenario. Perhaps the guests would like to explain to me what happens when you take an airliner out with a missile over the top of central London. What is the difference? It's a farce.
So why are they doing it?
It's part of the Islamophobia mass hysteria. We have to keep terrorism alive. So again, I challenge you, what terrorist group carried out an attack? Even 7/7 was an inside job.
Okay, anyone want to take that on? Inside jobs, 9/11, 7/7? Christina?
Yeah, I find truth claims highly entertaining. I mean, I think the stories are really entertaining, and there's just so many out there. I have, over the years, given up the search for the truth and have just enjoyed the stories as they come across. I don't deny the existence of Al-Qaeda. I think there was something out there. To what extent it was ever an organization is something I find questionable. I think they, as in Osama bin Laden and key leaders, might have aspired to be something more bigger that they could have been. But I think too much has been made out of it. It has been subject to so much speculation, and so many people have used it for their own, to suit particular arguments. I've rather than looking at a particular truth claim as such and trying to figure out whether it's true, I'm more interested in what particular truth claims tell about the people who actually come up with these different ideas.
Okay, but that's not quite the same as Peter's position, which is that the Madrid attacks, the London transport bombings of 2005, and the 9/11 attacks of 2001 were inside jobs by those governments.
Oh, no, I disagree with that. I think Peter's position is very far away from my own on this particular point.
And so you do believe there is an organization called Al-Qaeda that carried out these attacks?
To the extent that there was the Madrid bomb, and I don't want to put together all these different attacks. The Madrid bombing is very different from what happened in London and very different from 9/11. And to put them all into one, I think, would be a gross oversimplification.
Okay, perhaps maybe turning to what is likely to be a more mainstream version of the events of the last 10 or so years, maybe turning to you, Lorenzo, maybe we could give us your take on how different the organization Al-Qaeda is today to how it was, say, back in August 2001, before the big attacks that made such a mark on modern history.
Well, first of all, let me just restate that I strongly disagree with some of the statements made earlier about the conspiracy theories and so on and so forth on all three attacks mentioned. Back to your question, there's been a massive change, as it's been sort of touching upon in terms of what was the Al-Qaeda Central, the organization, being disrupted in different waves. I mean, starting with the loss of the sanctuary in Afghanistan in 2001 after the U.S. invasion, to the drone campaign, over which we can of course discuss over the last couple of years, that has really prevented Al-Qaeda Central from functioning as it was before 9/11, controlling cells throughout the world, having training camps and virtually operating undisturbed, planning attacks. That has really changed over the last few years. So what we have seen is that we have franchises, mostly in 4 different parts of the world, specifically in the Maghreb, North Africa, Somalia, in Iraq, and in Yemen, functioning as sort of franchises, offshoots, with different degrees of cooperation and coordination with the Al-Qaeda Central. I think it's fair to say that for the most part they only ideologically refer to Al-Qaeda Central, although there is also some operational coordination, and also a variety of clusters, networks, individuals throughout the world, including here in the West, that simply adhere to Al-Qaeda's ideology but operate very independently, in many cases with a very local agenda. So what we said at the very beginning, Al-Qaeda as an organization, pyramid, as it was described 10, 15 years ago, is really no longer there. What we have is different groups and clusters adhering to the message and to the modus operandi of Al-Qaeda.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the 1-year anniversary of the death of Osama bin Laden. I'm joined by Christina Hellmich, author of Al-Qaeda, From Global Network to Local Franchise, Tina Soria from the Royal United Services Institute, Peter Eyre, a commentator on the Middle East, Lorenzo Vidino, author of Al-Qaeda in Europe, the new Battleground of International Jihad, and Robert Crowley from the security assessment firm, the Risk Advisory Group. Maybe, Robert, I'd like to turn to you there and get your take on what Lorenzo was just saying there, and possibly account for Al-Qaeda and how the organization has changed over the years, which back in the 1990s and 2000 and 2001 was launching large-scale attacks, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, the USS Cole, through to the Madrid bombings, the London trans bombings of 2005, to an organization which hasn't really produced any sizable attack in recent years and has, really suffered quite failed attacks. The Christmas Day attack on the Detroit Brown jet, Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber.
And I think that there's been significant counterterrorism successes in recent years. The expansion of drone activity has suppressed the group, and by the group I'm now talking about Al-Qaeda Central. It's kind of struggled to have the freedom of movement and communication that it would like, as seen by bin Laden's compound and the lack of communication devices that he had available to him. And because of that, the organization itself has put more emphasis on encouraging its franchises and affiliates and partners to mount attacks against the West on behalf of the wider global jihadi organization and movement. In terms of the affiliates themselves, I think probably most of the panel would agree that AQAP and AQIM have grown in stature.
Just for clarification, that's Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, and AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in northwest Africa.
Yeah, and operating in the Sahel, probably in southern Algeria and in the Kabylie region of northern Algeria. But both of those organizations have grown in stature in the past 18 months, become more operationally ambitious, but at present both appear content in consolidating the territorial gains they've made in the past year with the Arab Spring, rather than staging attacks against the far enemy.
Sorry, picking up on your point there, you're saying that the organization has gained from the Arab Spring, whereas another analysis is that Al-Qaeda really had little relevance in the Arab Spring, which was a pro-democracy movement and also a growth of Islamist movement, but a very, very different kind of Islamism to the extremist views espoused by Al-Qaeda. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Al-Qaeda failed to get guys out on the streets carrying placards with bin Laden's face on them, but what the affiliates are doing, especially AQAP in Yemen, kind of taking advantage of the security vacuum and the political instability in the country and consolidating the gains that it's made, building territory, laying down some kind of base and some foundation. And this is what the US is most concerned about, that in these ungoverned spaces, these affiliates are now growing and their capabilities could be growing and they could be starting to plot attacks against the West again.
Maybe turning to you there, Tina. I think in one of your comments earlier, you said that the ideology is still alive. How do you demonstrate that? Because the way that I see it, in many ways, the ideology is dead. It's failing to capture the imagination in the same way it was in the previous decade.
Well, not really. If you look at the way the ideology or these organizations been able actually to spread the ideology, obviously using more recently online propaganda. And, this is something that you can't, it's not easy to quantify how many people are still getting radicalized by looking at AQ propaganda online and so on. But the ideology is still there. And the fact that some of these affiliates are actually turning to and using the AQ ideology of global jihad to actually somehow being part of a global movement, so to say, and this is something that they are doing in order even to gain some kind of credibility and status among extremist circles. And if you look also the way AQ affiliates, even in AQ in Iraq, for example, is actually exploiting, as other speakers were saying before, the instability even in neighboring Syria, actually to possibly expand its reach. And absolutely, the ideology is still there, and it's the ability of groups and spokespeople actually to use that ideology to instill the hatred for the West and inspire people to take on the fight, even individually, as we've seen more recently.
Christina, is it an organization that still inspires?
We need to come back to the question of what is Al-Qaeda's ideology, and I think that's a difficult one to answer, especially with voice of bin Laden gone. There is now, there have been even before, but now there's an even greater fragmentation of different voices who try to claim to speak for Al-Qaeda. I think the original idea of the pan-Islamic idea that bin Laden proclaimed, pointing out the suffering of Muslims across the world at the hands of Western foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, I think that's still and continues to be a very sentimental issue. Looking at the suffering of Palestinians, looking at the situation in Iraq, I think these are emotions that carry a lot of weight, and I don't think that has changed. The extent to which that basic idea that has once been, I think, the key idea of Al-Qaeda been integrated and adjusted to local conflicts is a very different story. So what is the ideology of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen? Is that still related to bin Laden's idea? I would say it still has some overlaps in theory, but I think in practice we see a much more localized movement where the enemy is much more, the enemy description or the goal targets are much more local within the constraints of Yemen. And I think that goes with Al-Qaeda in Iraq in a similar way. So what the objectives are there are very different again, and that kind of brings us to the next question of how important is the far target at this point? Are we really dealing with the local insurgencies, if you so want, and is there still a commitment to the big enemy abroad, i.e. the West, the United States?
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the one-year anniversary of the death of Osama bin Laden. I'm joined by Christina Hellmich, author of Al-Qaeda From Global Network to Local Franchise, Tina Soria from the Royal United Services Institute, Peter Eyre, a commentator on the Middle East, Lorenzo Vidino, author of Al-Qaeda in Europe, the new Battleground of International Jihad, and Robert Crowley from the security assessment firm, the Risk Advisory Group. I'd like to get Peter to come back in there, because obviously you've got a different take on Al-Qaeda from the other speakers. And I'm just wondering at this stage, having listened to what they've said, have you heard anything that's changed your mind?
Not at all. First of all, I'll just touch base on Madrid, because you've raised that for the second time during this small debate. If you analyse the outcome of that case, the Islamic groups were not blamed for the Madrid bombing. That is the court verdict. So one can challenge that, but the verdict was it was not an Islamic group. So we can take Madrid bombing out of the equation. Okay, forget all the others, just take that one out. Nobody's talked about Taliban, for instance, during this conversation. One has to understand that Taliban at the moment is the number one problem for the Western forces. Taliban at one stage were in bed with America in a very big way. All the tribal leaders were invited to Houston for a wonderful week to negotiate the TAPI pipeline, which was going to bring in several $1 trillion to the American economy. That's what the war in Afghanistan was all about, and it was to protect the opium crop, not to destroy it. So we'll just drift off that a minute, and we'll talk about other terrorist groups. And this is from a totally different angle. No comment has ever been made of political terrorism, No comment has ever been made about intel terrorism or commercial terrorism related to this. So now we'll come back to that dreaded group people don't want to talk about, which is called the New World Order. And if the readers haven't heard about it, I can assure you it does exist. And as an example, one small group in America, which is part of that organization, headed by Paul Wolfowitz, in 1997 declared they were going to take out 7 countries in a period of 5 to 10 years, a minimum of 7 Islamic countries. That was fortified again just after 9/11 when General Leslie Clark met in the Pentagon and confirmed that.
Just to cut the theory down, to shorten it down and specifically tailor it to the conversation we're having.
Sure.
According to your theory, I mean, you've taken Madrid out of the equations, but Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, USS Cole, September 11th, Bali, London Transport, who did those?
With 9/11, there was probably 3 groups involved. Mossad was right up there in the front. CIA were involved, and the New World Order group, under a small section of the New World Order group, were involved in that. Mossad operatives were caught by the New Jersey police, 7 of them. They were seen dancing in Arabic dress near the scene of the disaster, and that was filmed. And then on interrogation, they found out they were Mossad operators. When they were apprehended, they were held for 7 hours. And eventually, when they found out they were Mossad, they were dispatched back to Israel.
Okay, on that specific point, Lorenzo or Robert, over the line. I mean, obviously, this isn't the first time that we've had a conspiracy theory about 9/11 brought forward. Is there any evidence or is there any doubt in your mind that the traditional, conventional view that it was carried out by an Islamist jihadist organization called Al-Qaeda, is there any doubt in your mind that that is the case?
No, absolutely not, if I might. And let me say, a lot of the facts, of course, these are conspiracy theories that you just have to Google and you'll find plenty of them and even more fanciful versions. But let's start with Madrid, for example. Just when your speaker tells some certain facts, those are just incorrect. When he says there's no court, where the court verdict in Madrid was nothing to do with Islamists, I was actually in the courthouse on October 31st, 2007, where Jamal Sugam and other people, all Muslims, all Al-Qaeda sympathizers, were convicted for the Madrid bombings. So if you want to have a conspiracy theory, the first part is to get the facts right. Anyways, to your second point, I think the evidence is there. Of course, as any large event, there are, of course, things that even if you have the facts right, seem kind of suspicious, but I think the evidence is all out there. All the conspiracy theories have been dispelled, and there's no doubt in my mind, and I would say most reasonable people's mind, that 9/11, as Madrid, as London, as virtually all the attacks you talked about were carried out by either Al-Qaeda as an organization or by groups or individuals linked to Al-Qaeda.
And what about a softer version of the same argument, which would be that the scale and power and organizational capacity of Al-Qaeda has been exaggerated by the United States in order to create some kind of justification for wars in the Middle East?
That is absolutely much more conceivable. That is fair. I think we get into a more political debate about that. There is no question that, for example, expanding the conflict, making Iraq part of the war on terror was unquestionably part of a certain mindset that existed in some of the milieus about which your speaker was talking about. The way, in a way, the capabilities of Al-Qaeda were, in a way, portrayed as larger than what they actually were. I think those are fair points. We can discuss what the intentions were, whether that was done out of lack of knowledge, fear, overreaction to the attacks, or more to sort of appease certain sordid interests that certain milieus within the U.S. government had. I think those are fair points, but to portray 9/11 and other attacks as point-blank conspiracy theories, I think that's just not supported by any fact.
Okay, we're running out of time here. Maybe I'd like to turn to Robert at this stage and do a little bit of horizon scanning. What are you predicting with Al-Qaeda over the next few years? Are you expecting a kind of Hydra-headed resurfacing of the organization somewhere in the Sahel or with Boko Haram? Or are we very much seeing the tail end and the death of this organization?
I personally think that Al-Qaeda's ideology continues to resonate, and I see no sign that that's going to stop in the next couple of years. As you've just pointed out, there seems to be a kind of a growing trend that jihadist activity is moving further towards Africa for some reason, possibly to do with the large porous borders, large Muslim communities that are extremely poor. This ideology is resonating, especially across the Sahel, and you brought up Nigeria with Boko Haram. So if I was kind of to make a prediction, I think some of these affiliates, most likely AQAP, is going to strengthen in the next 18 months, whereas Al-Qaeda Central, the core group, I think it's probably a bit too early to say whether that is kind of finished as an organization, but what I will say is it's been around for the last 25 years, it's extremely resilient, and if it can get through the next year or two, then possibly it's going to stay here for a long time.
So, Christina, on that point, I suppose, is there any chance over the next few years that we could go and visit an airport and take a flight without having to check in 3 hours before our departure time? Or are we stuck with these kind of anti-terror measures?
I wish. I don't think the preoccupation with security is going to go away. I think that has become too much of an important, almost universally accepted factor in life that very few people question. So I don't think that mindset of keeping us secure and the focus on securitization is going to go away. But that is more to say about us as a society and our own preoccupation with security than about the actual jihadist threat. Now, in the bigger picture, is the jihadi ideology going to go away? I don't think so. I think it's here to stay for a while to come. Do I disagree with what was previously said about the strength of AQAP? I do. I think I disagree very much with the idea of ungoverned spaces in Yemen. I very much see AQAP in contest with other Islamist organizations where they are currently renegotiating legitimacy in a political space that's open for reorganization. But I think what we see here is the outplay of practical local needs, and these contest with the bigger ideal of global ambitions. And somewhere in between the practicalities of the local and the ideal of doing something global against the big enemy, we will see a continuum.
Yeah, on that point, Tina, are they still looking at the far target, or are they too much on the back foot?
The point is, much of the remaining operational figures within AQ, I'm pretty sure they are still too much worried about and concerned about hiding at the moment for really posing an immediate prominent threat to Western security for the time being. Having said that, it doesn't mean that the threat is no longer there, and we shouldn't be complacent about it, because the way itself the Al-Qaeda has been able to reorganize and to really adapt. And I agree with Robert when he says that the organization and the whole, I would say, rather than the organization, the AQ movement has proved to be extremely resilient over the last few years. And so in this sense, we should still be aware of the ability of the movement and the whole AQ ideology to really stay there for still a few years, and I think. And of course, nobody should have been under the illusion that eliminating bin Laden would have put an end to AQ movement itself.
That was Tina Soria from the Royal United Services Institute saying that Al-Qaeda is on the back foot, but it's a resilient organization, so don't get complacent. I was also joined by Christina Hellmich, author of Al-Qaeda from Global Network to Local Franchise, Peter Eyre, a commentator on the Middle East, Lorenzo Vidino, author of Al-Qaeda in Europe, the new Battleground of International Jihad, and Robert Crowley from the security assessment firm, the Risk Advisory Group. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest update on world news.